Well, we've had two days and the keynotes of very, very intense deliberation on matters that are evidently not merely of academic interest, but also that preoccupy us and in which we are complicit in deep, profound, personal ways. So, summarizing all of these themes and currents and disquietudes that have come up is not an easy task. So what I'm really going to do is to just put out 2 or 3 remarks now, and then invite each of the distinguished contributors to this discussion around the panel, Amar, Akeel, Maya, Bernd, and Ravi, to share with us perhaps a sort of concentrated set of remarks which could be the basis for the discussion in this session. I've been haunted through these days by about four very actual things. I've been thinking of what it is that this species has prided itself on over millennia. Tools, the ability to make tools, the ability to craft language, the ability to produce habitats that stand against a natural habitat, and the possibility of leaving behind residues in the form of art. These are at least 4 of the things that, and I'm looking right at you, Ram, and thinking, gosh, I should have said science. But let me think of residues in terms of that which exceeds practicality and which then remains as some kind of intellectual, artistic, cultural heritage. And it's when I think of this idea of the residue that it seems to be at the same time productive, potentially constructive, and yet toxic. And there's been something about the nature of our discussions, particularly today, when so much that is catastrophic in what we've done to ourselves and our habitat that's come to the fore. I would just maybe hold in mind this notion of the residue. What is it that remains? What is it that is there but more than a remainder? Which brings with it questions of the afterlife, of mortality, and that's why I think this is a very portentous title that we're going to be addressing. Are we capable of futures? Because as a species, we've demonstrated such dramatic irresponsibility towards our own habitat. I invoked Gregory Bateson yesterday, who wrote that the species that overcomes its environment, that wins against its environment, will destroy itself. So it's under that sign that I think some of what we're doing here could unfold. And yet, are there resources of hope, is the question I'd put out. Akeel, could I invite you to begin?
Thanks, Ranjit. I was actually talking about this. I was talking about this over lunch, actually, about our great urge in the last decade or more to not distinguish ourselves from other kinds of subject, non-human subjects. And there's an anxiety that if we did distinguish ourselves in our capacities in some clean or radical way from others, as we have tended to for some centuries, especially in the modern period, we would undermine the grounds for giving rights to non-human subjects. So that's been a big tension in our intellectual history and self-understanding. And my own view is that we should just relax about this. This should not be a source of anxiety. There is absolutely no reason that one has to give a total likeness between all subjects who are supposed to have rights. After all, we worked very hard to remove the demand for likeness when we said people don't have to be the same color in order to have the same rights. So there's every reason to think that one might be able to present a subject as a possessor of rights, even though it is not like the human subject. And I don't think there is any intellectual source for anxiety. We should just learn to relax with the fact that we can give non-arbitrary reasons for giving rights to subjects who are not like us in one or other respect. So I feel no tremendous anxiety to say every subject is in some important respect like us. I feel no anxiety. We should be unanxiously acknowledge that we are capable of things that other subjects are not. The example I gave over lunch to Scherer was, you know, I saw two people there, and one person in the cafe, and one person was behaving very considerately towards another. Now, the idea that I can perceive two people, one of whom is considerate to another, is going to be something that a frog can actually also perceive is absurd. I mean, we are possessed of capacities for perception that are absolutely unique among subjects so far as we know. And I think that has given rise to, and I think we got a very smart set of criteria for what makes us just now in the opening remarks, though there's slight parochialism about saying that what endures with us is art. And I can see, and yes, right, and I can see Ram was agitating for science as well. Okay, so that's just one initial remark. If I may, since I do have to look, can I just have another 5 minutes, and then I want to take this chance, Ranjit, if I may, to respond to a couple of things that surfaced, which struck me as, you know, and I didn't have a chance to speak then, but they struck me as significant and worth presenting such opinions as I have on them. A couple of things that Amar said prompted me to think about their significance, and then there was an exchange with Nilanjan and Ravi, and I want to say something about a neglected part of Ashok's remarks this morning, which, let me begin with that. You know, Ashok, you began by saying that it's quite possible that we are mistaken to think of nature along the same lines as we've always done, because nature has become unnatural in a way. There's just too much artifice in nature, and we should just recognize that the concept of nature has therefore changed. And you cited Tim Morton, and I must say I can't pretend that I understand what Tim Morton said, or almost anything in that book of his. But I am moved by your point. But I do think that it's very important not to assume, whether it's of nature or of modernity generally, that the non-natural or the artifice, or for that matter modernity's reach, is comprehensive. There's no reason to think that modernity's reach is comprehensive. There are pockets of life, not just regional pockets in different parts of the globe, but pockets in each one of our mentalities that is not completely taken over by modernity. And so what I would generally say, and this surfaced a little bit on the evening, the first evening, we should take very seriously the idea of what psychologists call the frames, right? Our minds are compartmentalized by frames. It's just, there's no way we can avoid that. It's just maybe we've evolved. And very often we think in certain frames which are totally unlike how we think in another frame, and we don't even know we're being inconsistent. And so we might think in frames that are not contaminated by the sorts of things we say disdainfully is the corruptions of modernity and so on. But, and without being described as nostalgic for some old view of nature or anything. The charge of nostalgia is actually, I think, a highly ideological charge. I mean, so for instance, there is a phenomenon which is there everywhere, in politics especially, that it's too late, right? It's too late. And that's really another way of saying you're nostalgic. So people say you can't go to pre-67 borders in Israel. It's too late. There are just too many settlements. Right? But nobody ever said in the West, oh, well, 1/5 of the country has lost the idea of private property after the rise of, after October 17. It's too late. Let's grant that private property is not absolutely essential. They fought the idea of abolishing private property for 70, 80 years until they toppled the regimes which abandoned private property. Nobody said it's too late. Nobody said it's nostalgic to go back to the idea of private property in Soviet Union. They worked for 80 years with every material and ideological tool that they could get to overturn that regime. So it's a completely ideological, what you find nostalgic and what you find is too late. And I think that it's, sorry. So I don't think we should say, oh, well, it's nostalgic to go back to older forms of nature and so on. There are pockets of it, pockets of our thinking, which, you know, are completely attuned with nature in the old sense, and pockets of our thinking which are not. And usually the pockets which are not attuned to nature in the old sense are a result of having taken a course in economics.
Can we hold the responses for the end after?
Sure, just one sentence, that it was a call for creativity. It was a call for creativity, not against nostalgia. It was a call for a very specific form of emergent creativity practice that I think should be discussed here as a way of life, as a way of doing not just what we call art as making objects, not residual to what is being discussed here, but as actually what is being discussed here. It should be.
I was just responding to the initial remarks you began with, which you actually took in your stride, and then it prompted you for your very interesting thoughts later on. But this about how nature was already unnatural and it was wrong to think that we could return to. Oh, there was polemics. Okay, well, okay, all right. Okay. Just one point. I'll stop after this. Amar, actually 2 points. One is you made this very insightful point about how when there's violence done to a natural surrounding, it's absolutely narrowing to see it in terms that don't take into account the fact that you haven't just pulled down a tree or dammed up some flow of water, but you've actually undermined the meanings and emotions and significances of the minds of a whole group of people. And so there's no way to understand nature independent of something shot through with meaning and significance and emotion. So it isn't just the physical destruction, but much, much larger destructions have taken place. And you know, I mean, it's a little bit like saying that if this table is in a play, that you will see it as a bunch of molecules. Well, it isn't. It's a place where negotiations are made, where conviviality of a family is, and it would be bizarre to see it as a physical thing because it's just something completely different. So it's the same with nature, and in fact, that is exactly how I would say almost 2/3 of the world thinks about health. Right? The health is not just the dislocation of a limb, but it's the loss of equilibrium of meanings and emotions and so on. And cure would be a restoration of that equilibrium and not just, say, surgery on a limb and so on. So that's how much of the world thinks of it. And I think so it's worth making the point about health as well as violence and so on. But let me just end with one extremely interesting point you made, which is that the other way of doing it, which is not just that you fix it, that there's a fix of it, which is, but also that the other way of doing it, you used a marvelous description of it, which is that it's forensic, that you find out who did it and all in a very forensic way. And I think it is really a very deep point that we have started for the first time seeking forms of justice through processes that are not forensic. And that was the great innovation of Bishop Tutu in South Africa, where you don't just forensically investigate crimes, but you actually allow the people to speak, to confess. Confession becomes the highest form of evidence, which it was, by the way, it never was ever since the Enlightenment. Right? Confession was the highest form of evidence in old regime France. It's only in Enlightenment France that the penal code, and Foucault's written on this, that the penal code makes forensic investigation much more important than confession and things like that. And Tutu was basically going back to older non-forensic forms of seeking justice, and I think that that's maybe a very important way of I mean, here it would be like the Holy Grail if we could make all of the law more than forensic. I mean, I don't, I think it would mean really overturning all of the Enlightenment to do that. But as far as we can, if we make even just ordinary criminal courts less forensic than they are, I think it would have dividends, including ecological dividends, because its multiplier effects would be enormous. But that's a very cryptic remark. But anyway, I'm going to stop now. Thanks.
And just set me thinking, if I could respond briefly. We're talking about one end of the process is the seeking of justice, but another dimension of it is a more punitive dimension. And there was a strong aspect of the voluntary and the empathetic to the kind of confession that Tutu privileged in the commission. So I just thought I'd add that to the recognition that empathy is a virtue in itself to someone who's facing punitive action. That sort of complicates this narrative a little, but maybe we should hold on to this thought. I'm going to ask you to go next, Maya, if I may.
Is this on? Okay. Actually, I'm really glad you brought up the question of the frog, because it provides an entryway to a slight clarification that 15 minutes of jumping through things did not make possible. I think rather than trying to, like you very rightly said, trying to assimilate other kinds of life in the world to a human-centric model and say that they must be just like us in order to be accorded rights, I think opening up the notion of the political beyond a rights discourse, which of course there is much more to it than that, to a question of looking at the political as the technologies and negotiation processes and procedures and grounds by which we, whoever the we is, because that's a political question too, make the world together, against each other, with each other, and working at cross purposes with each other. But it is fundamentally a question of world making, and the how of the world making, and the who of the world making, and who is excluded and who is included, who has the right to speak, whose interests are acknowledged, how are the interests formulated. So yes, obviously, definitely, the idea is not to have a Dr. sort of Doolittle island with little UN translation devices that would allow everybody to speak in some universal trans-species Esperanto in order to negotiate how we're going to live together, but rather an observation that actually, and I'm thinking very much of Ram's wonderful talk yesterday, whether we're talking about individuals within a given species, which, for example, we know many species have actual language. It's like orcas have different dialects even. Elephants and many other species, some animals are problem solvers. Many species of animals have forms of sociality and even some forms of they have social hierarchies, etc. This is all very well documented. But beyond individual creatures or individual species, natural systems, emergent natural, non-linear, that are governed by a confluence of physical and chemical laws of nature. And again, this, as Ravi pointed out yesterday, the word laws of nature, it depends on whose nature and to whom and at what scale and in which context the law is actually being observed. But it is clear that the world is a dynamic place in which something like agency or the capacity for action for affecting change, and even, yes, sometimes we can attribute things like intentionality, certainly the transfer of knowledge or information, or at least something we might call data, occurs within the natural non-human world at a vast scale and at a level of sophistication that makes our best technologies look like child's play, which is why ecosystems are able to function on their own without our interventions, and why when this butterfly effect is when small introductions of tinkering and tampering to the natural workings of these very complicated emergent nonlinear systems, when that takes place, all hell breaks loose. And so in asking the question about whether or not we could extend it for at least a thought experiment, the idea of the polity or the political body beyond the human, it's not to say we should dress up animals in clothes and have translation devices to all talk about, whether dogs and cats and mosquitoes or bacteria should have rights. It is to say that actually we are already and inextricably entangled in a material world of other kinds of agents, and that we ignore that at our peril, and that the most important physical and material manifestations of the Anthropocene, whatever it is, or the Capitalocene, or the Totolocene, or the Plantationocene, this ecological disaster that has been unleashed by human activity, not by all human activity, but the activity is by some humans, and it's not by space aliens, and it's also not by mosquitoes or crocodiles or cyanobacter. It's activity by humans that has unleashed a destabilization of virtually every one of the major 9 planetary boundaries. And the non-linear emergent systems, which have forms of agency as well, are enunciating their responses. California's on fire. The drought across the world is causing, farmers to commit suicide. That we live in a feedback loop that takes our actions into a much more complex causal equation. And so I'm positing, if we think, even if it's metaphorical, of our relationship in this larger web of complex processes of agency and causal relations and mutual consequentiality, that our beings affect one another, that we have to, and we think about that as a question that is political. Who is excluded, who is included, who's actually taken into consideration, what is seen as having a legitimate existence, and whose existence is actually taken onto the table in the consideration of how we're going to actually do things and live together. If we change our thinking about the we to include a larger world, and if we replace an economical model of political relations, such as the rational choice that Akeel talked about, which is deeply embedded in the kind of thinking of the Western Enlightenment, neoliberal notions of possessive individualism, which many believe is one of the core problems that has caused this situation, then perhaps thinking about the political as an ecosystem set of relations rather than economic set of relations might lead us to live in different ways. So, and if we live in different ways, then the who we are becomes something else. So it's that level of questioning that I'm asking us to think about more. And we'll have local answers to these questions, obviously, that will stem from local traditions and local ways of knowing. And hopefully, there'll be myriad ways to try to address the crisis that we're in, because we need us all hands on deck right now. Thanks.